So today we're cycling the 50 kilometres from Tralee to the town of Listowel along Eurovelo 1. We're starting here at Blennerville and then we're turning right onto the Tralee shipping canal. That's the turn there on the right. Now it's worth exploring the shipping canal in the opposite direction. There's some nice scenes. There's also a potential wild camping spot. And I will upload a video about the canal and showing the rest of the route along the canal at a future date. So subscribe to the channel if you want to catch this. But for now we're heading for Tralee. So Tralee is what could be called a garrison town in the Irish context, which is basically a town that became one of the sites of British rule, and in this case over kind of Kerry and parts of Cork. It was the headquarters of the Munster Fusiliers, and as you're coming through on Eurovelo 1, I missed my turn off here at this spot. And I turned onto Denny Street. I should have gone straight on, and that would have got me onto a little bit of the railway route. But that does mean you go by Tralee Courthouse, which is interesting because it has two obvious British Army Imperial cannons outside, and that basically has survived into modern Ireland because they were commemorations of the men from the region who had died fighting with the Munster Fusiliers during the Indian Mutiny and during the Crimean War. In case anyone's inclined to take offence at my description of Tralee as a garrison town, my great-great-grandfather fought in the Crimean War, and my great-grandfather and his three oldest sons all volunteered for World War I in the first week or so. My sympathies today are much more those of an Irish Republican, but like a lot of us, I have a relatively complicated family history. So Tralee itself goes back to the Norman invasion. It's yet another Anglo-Norman town, so again, that idea of set up to rule from that point of view. And it was where the Fitzgeralds were based, or as they commonly became known as the Desmonds. So Desmond comes from the Irish for South Munster, because basically that particular faction of Normans who were close to Strongbow basically got North Kerry, bits of Limerick, most of Waterford and most of Cork. So if you know Ireland, that's some of the most fertile agricultural land in the country, and it's quite telling that really the rule starts at Tralee, where the land gets a whole lot better than what we've been looking at over the last few days. So that's that section of the Normans who became more Irish than the Irish themselves. They adopted a lot of Irish cultural traditions, so they ended up supporting things like the Bardic tradition. They were the ones who financed that, and then in the Tudor period, when the Elizabeth I became quite a strident Protestant, they remained Catholic, and you got the various religious wars that were also wars about conquest and imperialism that happened in that period. And we've talked about those in the last few episodes as we've been cycling through South Kerry, where a lot of the key battles of the Desmond rebellions took place. A lot of the history we're going to be talking about in this particular journey is quite old. It's going back to that period, and really it's very reminiscent of your sort of Game of Thrones thing. So for instance, the Desmond rebellion ends with the beheading of the Earl, the confiscation of his lands, the execution of the garrisons of many of the castles, some of which we'll be passing in the next couple of days. And then you get what's called the Plantation of Munster, where the land is divided up and given to those who were loyal to Elizabeth, and then of course later on to Cromwell. So you get those different phases, and there's lots of really fascinating stories to be told about that, but you also get a continuation of a new set of earldoms and barons and all the rest of that sort of stuff, and they're basically just as bad as the ones that went previously. And I think, as James Connolly observed, there's not really all that much to choose between the various warring factions in this period if you are an ordinary person. None of them are really all that interested in you. It's basically a fight about wealth and power, with everybody else being expected to do a lot of the fighting for them. As you'll have noticed, the landscape has changed massively over what we've been cycling through in South Kerry over the last few days. The mountains have gone away from the coastline here, and it's mostly these big huge fields. There's cattle rather than sheep, and views that are going far over. Now there is an alternative to this section of the Eurovelo route. I have cycled that previously. If you have a look at the archive, you'll see it, and that's you go up the coastline by Bannastrand, Beal, Kerry Head, which is a small peninsula that you'll do in a couple of hours. and then you can cross the River Shannon at Tarbert, rather than what Eurovelo 1 does, which is it follows it to Limerick City and goes through Limerick. On balance, I actually do think that other route is probably nicer, particularly Eurovelo in Ireland is huge. It's about 3,000 kilometres. If you wanted to shorten it a little bit, I would probably from Tralee, I'd take the coast up to Tarbert, across there, and cut out the section I'm doing over those 2 days. But this is not to say there's nothing here. This landscape has got its own beauty. You're going to be passing a lot of ruins, castles, historic towns, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of those as we're going through, because, as I said, some of this makes great Game of Thrones material. After Tralee, the route avoids the villages and towns along here until it reaches a large village or small town called Lixnaw. I hope I pronounced that right. It's one of those tricky ones. And now Lixnaw nowadays is relatively small, but back in the day that it was the seat of the Barons of Kerry. They're created around 1320. And the Barons of Kerry are another story of people who are feuding with their nearest neighbours, particularly Carrigahold's castle on the other side of the Shannon. They're raiding each other's lands. There's, the records we have them are often enough complaints about raiding lands, killing each other's peasants, for lack of a better term. Peasants wouldn't have been the word used, renters or whatever. The Annals of the Four Masters, so one of the first early Irish historical documents, relates a raid in 1578, where it says, the young Abbot O'Torna, having joined the Earl, was killed at the castle door of Lixnaw by a ball shot after the Earl had entered the castle, and had there been no other evil done than the killing of the Abbot, it would have been great enough. A great number of Fitzmaurice's people were killed and drowned the same day. So, you get a sequence of those sort of events. So, the Earl of Kerry no longer exists, really, except I believe there's somebody in England claims the title, Lord Lansdowne, or somebody has it added on, and this is what happens to a lot of the historic Irish titles. We don't have lords anymore. Occasionally you find people that are using the title, but there's no lands anymore associated with it, and an awful lot of them ended up in England basically as absentee landlords. They spent time in Ireland, and at some point the family decides to go back, and then the title ends up over there. And that's true of the of the Lords of Kerry, and as they became the Earls of Kerry. And that is kind of the most fascinating story, because the first Earl of Kerry was actually a big fan of Lixnaw, and he built Lixnaw Court, which is a stupendous house, or rather was a stupendous house. So let's hear a little bit about that. So this ruin here, which is the Hermitage, is what put me onto this whole story. This, in fact, is only a folly. It was built at one end of a long avenue. The main road of the village, actually, we're about to cycle along, is that avenue. And at the other end was an absolutely huge monument stroke mausoleum. Now, this is all built by the first Earl. Why he was made an Earl, by the way, is not terribly clear. He was described as a tyrant, the most severe and inflexible character that can be imagined, obstinate and inflexible. His family did not love him, but dreaded him, as did his servants. And that's a description, by the way, from his own grandson. But Lixnaw Court, which he built, was of the most lavish of Irish houses, with a vast formal parkland of canals, avenues and set pieces. There were wages being paid for over 40 household servants in 1733, and on top of that you'd have had workmen, overseers, wood rangers and ploughmen. And the family also had a big house on St. Stephen's Green called Kerry House, and back there on the road a bit I labelled a particular view deer park, so that's where they had its 277 acre deer park on top of the 2,600 acres of the demesne itself. And that included, as I said, 3 canals. You can still see those 3 canals. So the interesting thing about this story, though, is how short-lived this place is. So there's the first Earl. He dies in 1742, by which stage he's made enemies of his eldest son and his daughter. Both of those were banned from his deathbed. He described his daughter as having married a mortal enemy of his. So the eldest son, who did inherit, he basically, the first thing he did was the father had built this vast Roman-style mausoleum he wanted to be buried in. He wasn't buried there, he was buried in a churchyard, and in fact it was the elder son who was buried there. But the elder son, he didn't last very long. He died of gout in about 7 or 8 years later, and then the third Earl took over, and the third Earl seems to have been another character, but of entirely different sort from the father. He made what was considered a terrible marriage to a Catholic widower. The two of them took off to Paris, where they spent vast amounts of money, to the extent that the estate itself went bankrupt, and then they had to flee Paris during the Revolution, and the title essentially ends with them. The house itself, by the 1790s, is described as a total ruin. The doors and the windows have been robbed out of it, and the lead from the roofs. The guy in charge of it blamed the local inhabitants for all this, who he said were of the most inhospitable in the country. And by the early 1800s, all that's left is a few chimneys. The trees have been cut down. The First Lord planted 50,000 trees a year. The orchards are in a poor state, are gone, and almost nothing is left. In 1776, the British traveller Arthur Young, who wrote fascinating travel accounts of Ireland, said, "All is desolation and everything in ruins, the walls and roof being removed by thieves and the trees cut down." And in fact, in a final insult, in 1957, Kerry Council blow up the monuments because they open a quarry on the site and they want to get it out of the way. So the Earl of Kerry and his inheritance is much like Ozymandias or Ramesses II in Egypt. It really didn't last very long indeed. And it's one of those houses that's so big you're kind of half going, it's a shame it's not there because it would be quite amazing to see. But the other half is going, thank God we got rid of that bunch. You could do an entire mini-series really on the story, but actually one final detail is during the 1798 rebellion, the mausoleum was broken into and the lead was stolen from the coffin. I would presume to be melted down to make ammunition. And you'll have noticed, apart from stopping at the pub, I also stopped briefly at what is an IRA memorial in the centre of Lixnaw. The local brigade was very active during the period of the War of Independence, actually from quite early on. Now I'm going to save those stories for the next segment of our route, which is leaving from Listowel, because some quite interesting things happened in Listowel during the War of Independence. There's two very interesting stories. We're just arriving here now. Do give a subscribe and give me a follow on TikTok and Instagram. I post things live there as I'm actually doing these trips. YouTube, it takes me a while to edit them together. Listowel's quite a nice town. The EV route is rather convoluted as it goes through it. That's because they've got a complicated one-way system. But it's also the start of a very long stretch of greenway, and that's the next video, is going to be taking you along the Greenway all the way to Askeaton, I think, or just sort of that. Listowel has a heritage trail. It also has yet another castle, so the garrison of this castle held out about the longest after the Desmond Rebellion and were then massacred afterwards. The bridge crosses over into Listowel Racecourse, which is famous for its annual races. And then the start of the Greenway is through this park, and the park is where I'm going to be starting my stories tomorrow, because there's a very interesting backstory to where this park came from that ties into a lot of the themes we've been talking about: land, republicanism and transformation in Ireland. It all helps keep us accompanied as we do the cycle, and gives something for me to talk about as you view the road footage. Anyway, I'm hoping all this is encouraging you to consider taking to the road and maybe doing this Eurovelo route in particular, and if so, perhaps one day I shall see you on the road.